The dry winds of Bitter Creek swept across the high Montana plains, rattling the sun-bleached grass and carrying with them the silence that only solitude could breed. Callie Brennan stood on the edge of her modest property, where a crooked wooden fence marked the boundary between her world and the protected wilderness beyond. Her camera hung at her side, untouched for most of the day. The sun was low, heat wavering above the dust, and nothing had stirred for hours, until now. Something moved beyond the fence. Callie squinted against the glare. At first, she thought it was a mirage, a trick of heat and shadow, but the shape became clearer, a Mustang. Gray as old smoke, leaned to the point of gauntness, its ribs visible beneath a dull, dust-coated coat. It stood motionless, halfway between proud and broken, watching her. She hadn't seen a Mustang this close in months. The drought had pushed most herds deep into the canyons in search of water, and yet, here this one was, alone and silent. Not grazing, not moving, just watching her. Callie exhaled slowly. Her boots crunched against the gravel as she walked to her lunch pail sitting on a fence post. She reached in, pulled out a red apple, dinged and bruised but still edible, and held it in her palm for a moment. "You're a long way from your herd," she murmured. The Mustang's ears flicked forward. She knew better. 20 years in wildlife biology had trained every instinct in her to observe without interfering. But those same years had also taught her to recognize desperation when it stood staring at her with sunken flanks and intelligent eyes. Sighing, Callie placed the apple gently on top of the fence post and stepped back several feet. "Take it or don't, I won't chase you." For a long moment the horse didn't move. Then it took a single step. Another. The way it approached wasn't wild. Not exactly tame either, but with a strange kind of grace, like it was aware of her presence and had already decided she wasn't a threat. It reached the fence, lowered its head, and with a slow, precise bite, took the apple in its teeth. Juice ran down its chin as it chewed, but its eyes never left hers. Callie felt her heart thud quietly. There was something in that look. A weight, a thought. The horse swallowed the last of the fruit, then lifted its head. For a moment longer it stood still, nostrils flaring in her direction, then gave a short, low nicker, so soft it almost didn't register. It turned and walked away, disappearing into the shimmering heat beyond the ridge. Callie remained there long after it had gone, arms crossed against the breeze that had picked up. The ranch dog didn't bark. The wind didn't howl. Just silence, and the echo of something she couldn't quite name. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, editing a few half-decent photos she'd taken the day before. Pine marten prints, a red-tailed hawk in flight. Nothing remarkable. But her thoughts kept circling back to that Mustang. It wasn't just its condition or its behavior. It was the way it had looked at her, not with fear, not with instinct, with recognition. "You're romanticizing it," she muttered under her breath, setting the camera aside and rubbing at the ache in her shoulder. She made tea, fed Jasper, her old tabby, but nothing settled the unease that lingered, like a dream she hadn't quite woken from. The rain came in the early hours, a soft patter on the tin roof, rare and welcome. By morning, the parched earth had only darkened slightly, but Callie felt a lift in her chest as she sipped coffee and watched the storm trail off into mist. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps against the front door, distinct, deliberate, and impossible. Callie froze. She lived 15 miles from town, her nearest neighbor a retired couple 3 ridges over who rarely ventured out. Visitors were never unannounced, not here. The knock came again. She placed her mug down slowly and moved to the door, pausing to peer through the narrow glass panel along the frame. Her breath caught. The Mustang was standing on her porch. Its coat was damp from the rain, darkened to a steely gray. Mud clung to its legs. Its eyes, those same eyes from yesterday, met hers again, and this time there was no doubt. This was intentional. But what arrested her breath was not the horse itself. It was what lay at its feet, a worn leather saddlebag, caked in mud, frayed at the seams, and entirely out of place on the porch of a woman who hadn't ridden in years. Callie opened the door slowly. The Mustang didn't flinch. It stepped back just enough to give her space, then lowered its head and nudged the bag gently toward her, like a dog delivering a glove. She stared, disbelief clawing up her spine. "What is this?" she whispered. The bag looked old, weathered. One strap was torn, the brass buckle nearly black with age. As she crouched to retrieve it, her fingers brushed something cold and solid, metal hidden beneath the leather. She looked up. The Mustang, still nameless, still impossibly calm, held her gaze. Then, in a motion that struck her like a whispered sentence, it dipped its head. A nod. Callie stood there, wet ground beneath her bare feet, wind tugging at her robe, saddlebag in hand. And for the first time in years she felt the old thrum again, curiosity laced with fear, the pull of something greater. The horse turned, stepped off the porch, and looked back over its shoulder. A question in its eyes. Callie clutched the bag to her chest. The symbols on the strap, etched by hand, nearly worn away, read EM, barely legible under the grime. Her fingers trembled. She didn't know it yet, but that single apple had bought her something far more valuable than gratitude. It had bought an invitation. The morning was still heavy with rain mist as Callie laid the saddlebag on her kitchen table. Her hands hovered for a moment above the cracked leather, fingers tracing the worn initials stamped into the flap. E.M. She stared at them, heart ticking louder in her chest. The bag smelled of earth and old dust, and something metallic rustling faintly inside promised mystery or madness. Jasper the cat leapt onto a chair, tail twitching as he watched from a cautious distance. Callie took a breath and flipped open the flap. Inside, layers of oilcloth, dark with age, had protected the contents from water. She peeled them back slowly, revealing a bundle wrapped tightly in linen, yellowed and brittle at the edges. She unfolded it with care. A small, leather-bound journal, its cover stiff with time, was tied with string. Beside it, nestled into a side compartment, was a folded map. Its corners curled and corners torn. A few sepia-toned photographs spilled out, the kind taken with heavy box cameras, showing landscapes that looked startlingly familiar. And at the bottom of the bag, as if tucked away as an afterthought, a cloth pouch jingled faintly with the unmistakable sound of metal. Callie opened the pouch. Inside, 5 gold nuggets, dulled but unmistakably real. She sat down hard, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. The journal's first page was faded but legible. Field notes of Dr. Elias Marchant, 1894. Her eyes snapped to the map. The handwriting was the same, elegant, old-fashioned cursive, the ink feathered but intact. She scanned the parchment quickly. Mountains sketched in charcoal, river bends, a gorge. One spot was marked with a bold X, not far from where her cabin now stood, within what was now protected Mustang territory. Callie exhaled through her teeth. "Okay, Elias, what the hell were you doing out here?" She flipped further through the journal. Each page detailed the doctor's survey of the region. Soil samples, geological sketches, even animal observations. Her fingers paused on a passage. August 19th. Sighted an unusual band of wild horses. more cohesive than any I've observed. Their leader, a gray stallion with intelligent eyes, appeared to guide his herd with uncanny purpose. They observe me from afar, but do not flee. I sense awareness. Callie blinked. Her eyes darted toward the window. The Mustang was gone. She stood quickly, pushing open the door. Muddy hoof prints led off her porch and curved toward the ridgeline. But there, just beyond the bend, the stallion stood, watching her. Not pacing, not grazing, waiting. "You brought this," she said aloud. "Why?" The horse gave a faint nicker. Callie glanced back at the journal, then at the horse. Logic scrambled in her brain. There was no plausible reason for a wild Mustang to carry a saddlebag for miles and deliver it to a human, and yet that's exactly what had happened. She looked down at her boots, her jacket hanging on the wall, the backpack she used on photo treks. It had been years since she'd gone past the permitted border. She knew the rules, the fines, the risk of losing her wildlife license. But something deeper than protocol pulled at her now. She stuffed the journal, the map, and her camera into her pack, slung it over one shoulder, and stepped onto the porch. The stallion, she couldn't keep calling him the Mustang anymore, turned and began walking. She followed. They moved in silence, save for the rhythmic crunch of her boots against the rocky trail. The stallion kept his pace steady, glancing back every few minutes as if checking on her. It didn't feel like randomness. It felt like a guide leading her somewhere specific. "I should call you something," she murmured. "Can't just keep saying, 'Hey, you.'" The horse flicked an ear. She smiled despite herself. "All right." Whisper, "You don't say much, but I'm listening." Whisper nickered quietly, as if in acknowledgement. "Yeah." They continued along a ridge that skirted the boundary of the conservation zone. Callie could see the rusted BLM sign half buried in dirt near an old post. Beyond that, it was federal land, off limits to the public except by research permit. She hesitated. Whisper stopped, turned to look at her. "Of course you want me to cross the line," she muttered. She stood there, heart pounding, staring at the invisible line between legality and something bigger. She thought about Elias Marchant, about the Mustang that had brought her a map over a century old. About the gold, about the way Whisper had looked at her like he remembered something older than memory. "I'm not trespassing," she said to no one. "I'm documenting." With that, she stepped over. The terrain beyond was rougher. Clumps of sagebrush, rock slides, narrow switchbacks. Whisper moved with grace, choosing paths Callie wouldn't have spotted on her own. Twice he paused to let her catch up, and once he stopped completely to drink from a rivulet that ran fresh from last night's rain. After nearly 2 hours, they crested a rise and came upon a clearing. From the vantage point, Callie could see a wide valley below, untouched, green even in drought. She gasped. Birds wheeled in the open air. A stream cut through the center, feeding a basin ringed with cottonwoods. And in the distance, near the foot of the ridge, stood a small outcrop of stone. From here, it looked unremarkable, but her fingers itched toward the journal map in her pack. Whisper waited beside her, head raised, nostrils flaring. "This is it, isn't it?" she said softly. He didn't move. She dropped her pack, pulled out the map, and unfolded it carefully in the wind. Her eyes tracked the contours, landmarks, and there it was, the valley, the same ridge, and that stone outcrop marked with a bold X. Her heart thundered in her chest. She turned to Whisper, who had lowered his head slightly, ears forward. "You knew where it was the whole time," she said. The stallion gave a faint stomp of his hoof. Not agitation, more like punctuation. Callie looked down at the map again. This was more than an abandoned survey site, more than buried gold. This was a story buried by time, and somehow this horse, this whisper, was trying to tell it. She folded the map, carefully stowed it, and looked out over the hidden valley. "All right, old soul," she murmured. "Lead the way." Whisper stepped forward, descending the path with certainty, and Callie followed, unaware that the next few hours would begin unraveling not just a mystery, but a legacy that had waited over a century to be found. The trail narrowed into a rocky spine flanked by wind-bent pines and jagged boulders. Below, the hidden valley stretched like a secret stitched into the land. Untouched, protected by the rugged terrain that had kept it out of sight for generations. Callie Brennan stepped cautiously behind the gray Mustang who had become her silent guide. Whisper moved ahead with steady purpose, hooves sure on the loose rock, glancing back every few minutes as if to check she hadn't fallen behind. Her breath caught every time they rounded a bend and saw more of the valley. It looked untouched by drought, lush pockets of green, patches of blooming wildflowers, and the shimmer of moving water winding through the brush. A stark contrast to the dry, brittle grassland she'd left behind. They descended a switchback carved by erosion and time, and the air shifted, cooler, damper, carrying the scent of sage, pine, and distant water. The hush of the place settled over her like a blanket. No hum of road noise, no chainsaws or radios. Just the whisper of wind in the leaves, the occasional rustle of movement from animals unseen. And then, movement. At first, it was just a flicker on the edge of vision, a glint of sun off muscle, a breath in the tall grass. Then they appeared in full. Mustangs. A band of at least 10. Stallions, mares, a foal no older than a few weeks. They stood on a rise across the valley, heads lifted, watching. Callie froze instinctively. Wild horses didn't linger around people. They bolted, fled, especially when foals were present. But these didn't. They watched. Whisper nickered softly. A mare, a tall, pale-coated horse with a gray patch over one eye, stepped forward, her ears flicking with recognition. She approached slowly, her gaze trained not on Callie but on Whisper. He whinnied low in his throat and stepped to meet her, pressing his muzzle gently against her neck. The herd relaxed, the tension dissolved. Callie stood absolutely still, heart racing. No one would believe this. She barely believed it. She raised her camera, slowly, cautiously, and clicked off a few shots. No reaction. The horses held their ground. Whisper returned to her side, then turned, walking across the open meadow toward a ridge of dark stone on the northern edge of the valley. Callie followed. The rest of the herd stayed behind, but she could feel their eyes tracking her every step. As they approached the stone face, Callie noticed something unusual, shapes carved into the rock. Weathered, shallow, but unmistakable. She dropped to her knees, brushing away moss and soil with trembling fingers. Figures, horses, human silhouettes, circles and spirals, a kind of primitive map. "Petroglyphs," she whispered, heart pounding. She leaned closer, snapping photos, adjusting for light. Her mind reeled. She'd studied tribal markings before, Shoshone, Crow, even earlier indigenous cultures, but she'd never seen this combination. These weren't just depictions of animals. They told a story of coexistence, of reverence. She looked up at Whisper, who stood quietly nearby, facing the petroglyphs as if in silent testimony. Her thoughts turned back to the map she carried. Marchant's hand-drawn chart from 1894. She fished it from her pack and spread it beside the stone. The contours matched. The petroglyph site was marked. Right here. A large boulder jutted from the base of the rock wall. It looked natural at first glance, but something about its angle didn't sit right. She knelt and pushed against it. Nothing. She circled around, searching. And then Whisper stepped forward. With a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his front hoof and scratched at the dirt beside the boulder. Dust and gravel scattered. Beneath the topsoil, a hint of old timber emerged. Splintered and gray, half buried by time. Callie's pulse surged. No way! She dropped to her knees again, clearing more dirt. The wood revealed itself bit by bit. Old support beams, possibly from a mine shaft or a geological survey post. A small iron ring was embedded in one of the timbers, rusted but still intact. "This is it," she breathed. "Marchant's dig site." She looked back up at Whisper, who stood still as stone, watching her work. She dusted off the map again, cross-referencing the markings. This wasn't just a dig site. It was the location of his final entry. The place where he'd described the intelligent behavior of the Mustangs. The place from which he'd vanished. Suddenly, the weight of it pressed down on her. How unlikely, how extraordinary this was. A horse had led her to a forgotten valley, to lost history, to a moment suspended in time. It made no rational sense. And yet, she was living it. She sat back on her heels, heart pounding, hands coated in dirt. Whisper stepped closer, lowering his head until his muzzle was inches from hers. "I don't know how," she whispered, "but you remember. Don't you?" The stallion gave a soft exhale, breath warm against her cheek. She looked out across the valley again. The Mustang herd had settled back into grazing, but they remained aware of her, ears swiveling, eyes tracking. This was their home. Not just a feeding ground, a sanctuary. A story they had kept alive long after men had forgotten. She pulled out her camera and began to document every inch of the petroglyphs, the beams, the markings. Light was fading fast, but she worked until her hands trembled from the chill. Finally, she returned to the meadow where Whisper waited. He glanced toward the setting sun, then toward the trail they'd taken to arrive. "You want to go back?" she murmured. The stallion stepped forward and nudged her arm lightly. It was time to leave. As they made the slow climb back toward the ridge, Callie kept looking over her shoulder. The valley below shimmered in golden light, the herd backlit like shadows from another time. She knew, without a doubt, that she had crossed into something bigger than discovery. She had found not just a place, but a bond, an understanding that spanned generations, carried not in words but in hoofbeats and silence. Tomorrow, she would tell someone. But tonight, she would carry this secret home, heavy, ancient, and alive. The knock on Callie's cabin door came 2 mornings later, hard and official. She opened it to find Dean Holt standing on the porch, his brown Stetson in one hand and a leather satchel in the other. The retired park ranger and part-time historian looked like the Montana wilderness itself. Broad-shouldered, silver-bearded, and quiet in that particular way of men who'd seen things and never bragged about them. Behind him, a government SUV idled in the drive, dust still swirling around its tires. "You called," he said simply. "I did." Callie nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "And I'm about to ask you to believe something that sounds impossible." Dean walked in, set his hat on the counter and folded his arms. "Try me." Callie didn't waste time. She laid out the journal of Doctor, Elias Marchant, the map, and the photos she'd taken in the valley, petroglyphs, the herd, the collapsed mine entrance. She told him about Whisper, about the saddlebag on the porch, about how the stallion had led her to the hidden valley. Dean sat through it all without interruption, his eyes scanning every image, every page. When she finished, he leaned back, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You found it. So you believe me?" He gave a short laugh. "I hiked those ridges for 30 years, and I never found so much as a solid trail leading west of Devil's Bluff. And you say a Mustang led you straight to it?" Callie nodded slowly. "More than once. He's not just wild, he's aware. He remembers." Dean stared at the petroglyph photos, then at her. "If this site is what you say it is, the moment it goes public, it's not going to stay peaceful for long." "I know," she said quietly, "but it's too important to hide." Marchant's expedition wasn't just a gold hunt. He documented intelligence in these horses we haven't even begun to understand. Dean nodded, thoughtful. "You'll need protection, the valley, the herd, yourself." She frowned. Protection from what? A knock interrupted them. This one, louder, sharper, less neighborly. Callie opened the door to a tall, lean man in a BLM field jacket, clipboard under one arm, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. He looked official, but there was something too polished, too rehearsed in the way he smiled. "Morning, ma'am. Eddie Blackwell, Bureau of Land Management." Callie glanced at Dean. His mouth tightened. "I heard you'd been poking around some restricted areas." Eddie continued smoothly. "Unconfirmed reports of artifacts. Wanted to follow up personally." "I have a permit," Callie replied, stepping just slightly into the doorway. "For photography." "Photography," Eddie repeated. "Right." Dean stepped forward, voice calm but firm. "You need something more specific than hearsay to show up uninvited, Blackwell." "I'm just doing my job," Eddie replied, smile tightening. "Protecting federal land." Callie studied him, something about his name tugging at the edge of memory. "Blackwell," she said slowly. "Any relation to Jeremiah Blackwell? The prospector who went missing out here in the 40s? "My grandfather," he replied with pride. "He always said Marchant found something big. Disappeared before he could file a claim. Folks thought he was crazy. Guess he wasn't. The message was clear. He knew, and he wanted it." Callie didn't answer. She shut the door without another word. Dean exhaled. "He's going to tell someone. Maybe already has." "I need to act now," Callie said, "before someone else gets there." By dusk, she had packaged digital copies of her photos, Marchant's journal scans, and a letter detailing the herd's behavior and the cultural significance of the petroglyphs. She sent them to 2 trusted contacts, a journalist she knew from her freelance work, and a wildlife anthropologist at the University of Montana. She hit send. There was no turning back. The next morning, Whisper returned. He came limping. A gash marked his left shoulder, fresh, shallow but jagged. Mud caked one flank. His breathing was fast, uneven. Behind him, the ground showed signs of struggle. Prints from boots, drag marks, trampled brush. Callie ran to him, heart in her throat. "What happened?" Whisper didn't answer, of course, but the way he stood, alert, defiant, told her enough. Someone had been there, someone who didn't belong. Dean knelt beside the Mustang, examining the wound. "Looks like wire, possibly barbed." He fought back, got out. Callie's stomach dropped. "They were in the valley." Dean rose. "And they'll be back, with equipment, maybe guns." She looked at Whisper, who didn't move from her side. "We're going now." The climb back to the valley was harder in the dark. Dean insisted on coming. He brought his old revolver just in case. Whisper led the way, despite his injury. They crested the final ridge just before midnight and saw the lights, flashlights, headlamps. 4 men in dark clothing setting up gear beneath the petroglyph wall. A generator buzzed faintly in the corner. One of them had a metal detector sweeping low over the dirt. "God damn it," Dean muttered. "They're looting it." Callie lifted her camera. Click, click, click. She captured everything: faces, gear, license plates on a nearby ATV. She turned to Dean. "We go to the sheriff. Tonight." By dawn, the footage had made its way to social media. The story caught fire fast. Wild Horse leads woman to lost archaeological site. BLM accused of cover-up. Mysterious Mustang protects sacred land. By noon, officials were scrambling. The sheriff issued a temporary restriction on access to the Bitter Creek region. A university ethics committee offered to fund and oversee a controlled survey. Public pressure grew by the hour. And in the middle of it all stood Callie and Whisper. But it wasn't over yet. That evening, as she sat on the porch watching the light fade, she saw him. Eddie Blackwell, stepping through the trees like a shadow, alone this time, but with something in his hand, a length of rope. Callie stood slowly, Whisper tensed beside her, ears back, muscles taut. "You should have just kept quiet," Eddie said, voice low and bitter. "That valley was ours. My grandfather died looking for it. You think I'm going to let a damn horse steal it from me?" Callie didn't flinch. "It was never yours." Eddie stepped forward. Whisper surged. Before the man could take a second step, the stallion lunged, not with blind fury but with focused warning. He reared, hooves slamming the ground between them, nostrils flaring. The sound was thunderous. Eddie stumbled back, falling flat in the mud. "You ever come near that valley again," Callie said coldly, "you'll answer to more than me. You'll answer to the world. And to the horse." Whisper stepped back to her side, eyes never leaving Eddie. The man scrambled to his feet and disappeared into the trees. Later that night, Callie stood with Dean beside the fireplace, Whisper resting outside the cabin window. "You think this will hold?" she asked quietly. Dean nodded. "It's moving fast now. Public outrage, legal pressure. This might be the one time bureaucracy works in nature's favor." She looked down at her hands. "They wanted to erase it. They can't anymore," Dean said. "You didn't just find history, you protected it." She glanced at Whisper, who stood facing the stars, his gray coat silver in the moonlight. "They protected it first," she whispered. "I just listened." 3 weeks later, Bitter Creek didn't feel quite so quiet. Drones from university researchers buzzed overhead at daybreak. Camera crews hiked with tripods slung over their shoulders. Trucks from local and national news outlets parked crooked along the gravel road that once only Callie Brennan traveled. And amid it all, mounted patrols from the Bureau of Land Management now escorted small groups into the hidden valley. Harmony Reach, as it had been officially renamed just days earlier. But not one step was taken there without Callie's voice in the room, and not without Whisper's silent oversight. Callie stood at the edge of the ridge overlooking the valley, arms folded, wind tugging her flannel shirt against her body. Below, the herd moved calmly among the spring-fed grass, unbothered by the researchers working quietly nearby. Whisper stood slightly apart from the others, watching the trail just as he always did. Dean Holt joined her, clipboard in hand. They're limiting access to 12 personnel at a time, no overnight stays, no machinery without written approval. "You did it, Cal. You bought this place time." Callie nodded, though her eyes never left Whisper. "He bought it time. I just translated." Dean gave a wry smile. "Let's not start giving animals more credit than the folks who stuck their necks out." But Callie shook her head. "He found me. He brought the journal. He led me to the valley. I didn't protect this place. He did. They all did." For over a century, Dean didn't argue. Behind them, Carson Mitchell from the State Office of Historical Preservation approached, tablet in hand. The preliminary analysis of the mine entrance shows a natural collapse, likely from the 1895 flood. Marchant's notes were dead on. The cave system behind it's real and rich, historically, not commercially. No active vein left. Callie exhaled. Relief, not disappointment. Good. The gold's not what they came for anymore, Mitchell added. They came for him. He nodded toward Whisper. Your horse is a damn legend now. He's not mine, Callie said simply. He never was. That afternoon, the research team confirmed that the petroglyphs embedded in the valley walls predated Marchant's arrival by centuries. Shoshone elders from the nearby Wind River Reservation had been invited to consult. They stood in silence before the carved rock, one woman placing her palm gently on the stone, eyes wet with reverence. These were ours, she whispered, and now they are his too. A week later, Dr. Mariana Voss arrived with her team, experts in both archaeology and animal behavior. Unlike most, she didn't question the strange intelligence in Whisper's actions. She simply asked to observe. She watched as the stallion retrieved a carved piece of wood from beneath a willow and carried it to Callie's cabin, his 7th such delivery. Each item different. Smooth stones, carved bone fragments, a rusted brass button from a 19th century coat. This is not scavenging, Voss murmured, kneeling to photograph one offering. This is selection, intention. Callie just smiled. He remembers more than we ever will. The viral video of Whisper standing over the collapsed mine entrance, nodding at Callie as she uncovered Marchant's field marker, had drawn over 18 million views. Schoolchildren across the country drew pictures of the Mustang messenger. Conservation groups launched fundraising campaigns. Lawmakers were now in talks to designate Harmony Reach a permanent cultural wildlife sanctuary, a rare move in a political landscape often slow to protect anything without a price tag. But the real treasure had already been revealed, not gold, not even history. Trust. Callie woke one morning to hoofbeats on the porch, not the sharp panic of flight, but the familiar rhythm of presence. Whisper was there, as always, standing at the door like he was checking in. In his mouth was something new, a strip of bark, softened and gnawed around the edges. Along one side, a rough series of scratches had been etched. She reached for it, heart fluttering. The marks weren't random. M. She didn't know if it stood for Marchant, memory, or miracle, but it didn't matter. She knelt in front of the stallion and held the bark between them. I hear you, Whisper, she said softly. I always will. He touched his muzzle gently to her forehead, then turned and walked into the dawn mist, the edge of his mane catching the light like silver thread. Months passed. Summer turned to fall. Tourists slowed. The valley rested. Callie's cabin had been declared a wildlife observation post, and researchers now rotated through in scheduled teams. She stayed on as custodian, a term she'd chosen herself. Protector, not owner. The land didn't belong to her. It never had. Whisper still visited, sometimes daily, sometimes not for weeks. But when he came, it was always with purpose. He brought gifts. He watched the trail. He guided lost hikers back to safe paths more than once. Locals began to say the valley had its own guardian now, something between myth and memory. And Callie, who had once buried herself in grief, now found herself writing again. Journals, articles, a book she titled The Horse Who Remembered. On the final page she wrote, Some truths cannot be measured in gold. Some guardians do not need walls or guns. What cannot be taken is what chooses to stay. She placed the page into her manuscript and looked out across the snow-dusted grasslands. Whisper was there, standing under a pine, watching. She raised a hand. He nodded once, slow and steady, as if to say, "The story goes on."